without the railroad last named. He now wagons from Culpeper Courthouse, which is just about twice as far as you would have to do from Harper's Ferry. Abraham Lincoln by George Haven Putnam, Part 2 out of 4. Report was given to Lincoln that 2 or 3 months' time would be required to manufacture the 30 mortar beds that were needed. A delay of any such period would have blocked the entire purpose of Grant's expedition. In his perplexity, Lincoln remembered that in his famous visit to New York 2 years before, he had been introduced to Mr. Hewitt, a well-known iron merchant, as a man who does things. Lincoln telegraphed to Hewitt asking if Hewitt could make 30 mortar beds, and how long it would take. Hewitt told me that the message reached him on a Saturday evening at the house of a friend. He wired an acknowledgment with the word that he would send a report on the following day. Sunday morning he looked up the ordnance officer of New York for the purpose of ascertaining where the pattern mortar bed was kept. "It was rather important, Major," said Hewitt to me, "that I should have an opportunity of examining this pattern, for I had never seen a mortar bed in my life." But this, of course, I did not admit to the ordnance officer. The pattern required was, it seemed, in the armory at Springfield. Hewitt wired to Lincoln asking that the bed should be forwarded by the night boat to him in New York. Hewitt and his men met the boat, secured the pattern bed, and gave some hours to puzzling over the construction. At noon on Monday, Hewitt wired to Lincoln that he could make 30 mortar beds in 30 days. In another hour he received by wire instructions from Lincoln to go ahead. In 28 days he had the 30 mortar beds in readiness, and Tom Scott, taken charge of the military transportation, had provided 30 flat cars for the transit of the mortar beds to Cairo. The train was addressed to U.S. Grant, Cairo, and each car contained a notification, painted in white on a black ground: "Not to be switched on the penalty of death." That train got through, and as other portions of the equipment had also been delayed. The mortars were not so very late. 6 schooners, each equipped with a mortar, were hurried up the river to support the attack of the army on Fort Donelson. A first assault had been made and had failed. The field artillery was, as Grant had anticipated, ineffective against the earthworks, while the fire of the Confederate infantry, protected by their works, had proved most severe. The instant, however, that from behind a point on the river below the fort shells were thrown from the schooners into the inner circle of the fortifications, the Confederate commander, Floyd, recognized that the fort was untenable. He slipped away that night, leaving his junior, General Buckner, to make terms with Grant, and those terms were unconditional surrender, which were later so frequently connected with the initials of U.S. G. Buckner's name comes again into history in a pleasant fashion. Years after the war, when General Grant had, through the rascality of a Wall Street pirate, lost his entire savings, Buckner, himself a poor man, wrote begging Grant to accept as a loan, to be repaid at his convenience, a check enclosed for $1,000. Other friends came to the rescue of Grant, and through the earnings of his own pen, He was before his death able to make good all indebtedness, and to leave a competency to his widow. The check sent by Buckner was not used, but the prompt friendliness was something not to be forgotten. Hewitt's mortar beds were used again a few weeks later for the capture of Island No. 10, and they also proved serviceable. Used in the same fashion from the decks of schooners, in the capture of Forts Jackson and St. Philip, which blocked the river below New Orleans. It was only through the fire from these schooners, which were moored behind a point on the river below the forts, that it was possible to reach the inner circle of the works. I asked Hewitt whether he had seen Lincoln after this matter of the mortar beds. "Yes," said Hewitt, "I saw him a year later, and Lincoln's action was characteristic. I was in Washington and thought it was proper to call and pay my respects. I was told on reaching the White House that it was late in the day, and that the waiting room was very full, and that I probably should not be reached. Well," I said, "in that case, I will simply ask you to take in my card." No sooner had the card been delivered than the door of the study opened and Lincoln appeared reaching out both hands. "Where is Mr. Hewitt?" he said. I want to thank the man who does things." I sat with him for a time, a little nervous in connection with the number of people who were waiting outside. But Lincoln would not let me go. Finally he asked, "What are you in Washington for?" "Well, Mr. Lincoln," said I have some business here. I want to get paid for those mortar beds." "What?" said Lincoln. "You have not yet got what the nation owes you. That is disgraceful." He rang the bell violently and sent an aide for Secretary Stanton, and when the secretary appeared, he was questioned rather sharply. "How about Mr. Hewitt's bill against the War Department? Why does he have to wait for his money?" "Well, Mr. Lincoln," said Stanton, "the order for those mortar beds was given rather irregularly. It never passed through the War Department, and consequently the account when rendered could not receive the approval of any ordnance officer, and until so approved could not be paid by the Treasury." "If," said Lincoln, "I should write on that account an order to have it paid, do you suppose the Secretary of the Treasury would pay it?" "I suppose that he would," said Stanton. The account was sent for, and Lincoln wrote at the bottom, "Pay this bill now." A. Lincoln. "Now, Mr. Stanton," said Lincoln, "Mr. Hewitt has been very badly treated in this matter, and I want you to take a little pains to see that he gets his money. I am going to ask you to go over to the Treasury with Mr. Hewitt and to get the proper signatures on this account so that Mr. Hewitt can carry a draft with him back to New York." Stanton, rather reluctantly, accepted the instruction, and, said Hewitt, he walked with me through the various departments of the Treasury until the final signature had been placed on the bill, and I was able to exchange this for a Treasury warrant. "I should," said Hewitt, "have been much pleased to retain the bill with that signature of Lincoln beneath the words. Pay this now." Towards the end of the war, he continued, when there was no further requirement for mortars, I wrote to Mr. Lincoln and asked whether I might buy a mortar with its bed. Lincoln replied promptly that he had directed the Ordnance Department to send me mortar and bed with the compliments of the administration. "I am puzzled to think," said Hewitt, "how that particular item in the accounts of the Ordnance Department was ever adjusted. But I am very glad to have this reminiscence of the war and of the President." Lincoln's relations with McClellan have already been touched upon. There would not be space in this paper to refer in detail to the action taken by Lincoln with other army commanders East and West. The problem that confronted the commander-in-chief of selecting the right leaders for this or that undertaking, and of promoting the men who gave evidence of the greater capacity that was required for the larger armies that were being placed in the field, was one of no little difficulty. The reader of history, looking back today, with the advantage of the full record of the careers of the various generals, is tempted to indulge in easy criticism of the blunders made by the President. Why did the President put up so long with the vaingloriousness and ineffectiveness of McClellan? Why should he have accepted even for one brief and unfortunate campaign the service of an incompetent like Pope? With no army experience, or a well-meaning politician like Banks with still less capacity for the management of troops, permitted to retain responsibilities in the field, making blunders that involved waste of life and of resources and the loss of campaigns. Why were not the real men like Sherman, Grant, Thomas McPherson, Sheridan, and others brought more promptly into the important positions? Why was the Army of the South permitted during the first 2 years of the war to have so large an advantage in skilled and enterprising leadership? A little reflection will show how unjust is the criticism implied through such questions. We know of the incapacity of the generals who failed and of the effectiveness of those who succeeded only through the results of the campaigns themselves. Lincoln could only study the men as he came to know about them, and he experimented first with one and then with another, doing what seemed to be practicable to secure a natural selection and the survival of the fittest. Such watchful supervision and painstaking experimenting was carried out with infinite patience, and with an increasing knowledge both of the requirements and of the men fitted to fill the requirements. We must also recall that, commander-in-chief as he was, Lincoln was not free to exercise without restriction his own increasingly valuable judgment in the appointment of the generals. It was necessary to give consideration to the opinion of the country, that is to say, to the individual judgments of the citizens, whose loyal co-operation was absolutely essential for the support of the nation's cause. These opinions of the citizens were expressed sometimes through the appeals of earnestly loyal governors like Andrew of Massachusetts or Curtin of Pennsylvania, and sometimes through the articles of a strenuous editor like Greeley, whose influence and support it was, of course, all important to retain. Greeley's absolute ignorance of military conditions did not prevent him from emphasizing with the President and the public his very decided conclusions in regard to the selection of men and the conduct of campaigns. In this all-perplexing problem of the shaping of campaigns, Lincoln had to consider the responsibilities of representative government. The task would, of course, have been much easier if he had had power as an autocrat to act on his own decisions simply. The appointment of Butler and Banks was thought to be necessary for the purpose of meeting the views of the loyal citizens of so important a state as Massachusetts, and other appointments, the results of which were more or less unfortunate, may in like manner be traced to causes or influences outside of a military or army policy. General Frank V. Greene, in a paper on Lincoln as Commander-in-Chief, writes in regard to his capacity as a leader as follows. As time goes on, Lincoln's fame looms ever larger and larger. Great statesman, astute politician, clear thinker, classic writer, master of men, kindly, lovable man. These are his titles. To these must be added military leader. Had he failed in that quality, the others would have been forgotten. Had peace been made on any terms but those of the surrender of the insurgent forces and the restoration of the Union, Lincoln's career would have been a colossal failure, and the Emancipation Proclamation a subject of ridicule. The prime essential was military success. Lincoln gained it. Judged in the retrospect of nearly half a century, with his every written word now in print, and with all the facts of the period brought out and placed in proper perspective by the endless studies, discussions, and arguments of the intervening years, it becomes clear that first and last and at all times during his presidency, in military affairs his was not only the guiding but the controlling hand. It is interesting, as the war progressed, to trace the development of Lincoln's own military judgment. He was always modest in regard to matters in which his experience was limited, and during the first 12 months in Washington, he had comparatively little to say in regard to the planning or even the supervision of campaigns. His letters, however, to McClellan and his later correspondence with Burnside, with Hooker, and with other commanders give evidence of a steadily developing intelligence in regard to larger military movements. History has shown that Lincoln's judgment in regard to the essential purpose of a campaign, and the best methods for carrying out such purpose, was in a large number of cases decidedly sounder than that of the general in the field. And he emphasized with McClellan that the true objective was the Confederate army in the field and not the city of Richmond. He laid down a principle which seems to us elementary, but to which McClellan had been persistently blinded. Lincoln writes to Hooker, "We have word that the head of Lee's army is near Martinsburg in the Shenandoah Valley, while you report that you have a substantial force still opposed to you on the Rappahannock. It appears, therefore, that the line must be 40 miles long. The animal is evidently very slim somewhere, and it ought to be possible for you to cut it at some point." Hooker had the same information but did not draw the same inference. Apart from Lincoln's work in selecting, and in large measure in directing, the generals, he had a further important relation with the army as a whole. We are familiar with the term "the man behind the gun." It is a truism to say that the gun has little value whether for offense or for defense unless the man behind it possesses the right kind of spirit which will infuse and guide his purpose and his action with the gun. For the long years of the war, the commander-in-chief was the man behind all the guns in the field. The men in the front came to have a realizing sense of the infinite patience, the persistent hopefulness, the steadiness of spirit, the devoted watchfulness of the great captain in Washington. It was through the spirit of Lincoln that the spirit in the ranks was preserved during the long months of discouragement and the many defeats and retreats. The final advance of Grant, which ended at Appomattox, and the triumphant march of Sherman, which culminated in the surrender at Goldsboro of the last of the armies of the Confederacy, were the results of the inspiration, given alike to soldier and to general, from the patient and devoted soul of the nation's leader. In March 1862, Lincoln received the news of the victory won at Pea Ridge, in Arkansas, by Curtis and Sigel, a battle which had lasted 3 days. The first day was a defeat, and our troops were forced back. The fighting of the second resulted in what might be called a drawn battle, but on the third our army broke its way through the enclosing lines, bringing the heavier loss to the Confederates, and regained its base. This battle was in a sense typical of much of the fighting of the war. It was one of a long series of fights which continued for more than 1 day. The history of the war presents many instances of battles that lasted 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, and in one case 7 days. It was difficult to convince the American soldier, on either side of the line, that he was beaten. The general might lose his head, but the soldiers, in the larger number of cases, went on fighting until, with a new leader or with more intelligent dispositions on the part of the original leader, a first disaster had been repaired. There is no example in modern history of fighting of such stubborn character, or, it is fairer to say, there was no example until the Russo-Japanese War in Manchuria. The record shows that European armies, when outgeneraled or outmaneuvered, had the habit of retiring from the field, sometimes in good order, more frequently in a state of demoralization. The American soldier fought the thing out because he thought the thing out. The patience and persistence of the soldier in the field was characteristic of, and it may fairly be claimed, was in part due to, the patience and persistence of the great leader in Washington. The dark days of 1862. The dark days of 1862 were in April brightened by the all-important news that Admiral Farragut had succeeded in bringing the Federal fleet, or at least the leading vessels in this fleet, past the batteries of Forts St. Philip and Jackson on the Mississippi, and had compelled the surrender of New Orleans. The opening of the Mississippi River had naturally been included among the most essential things to be accomplished in the campaign for the restoration of the national authority. It was of first importance that the states of the Northwest and the enormous contiguous territory which depended upon the Mississippi for its water connection with the outer world should not be cut off from the Gulf. The prophecy was in fact made more than once, that in case the states of the South had succeeded in establishing their independence, there would have come into existence on the continent not 2 confederacies, but probably 4. The communities on the Pacific coast would naturally have been tempted to set up for themselves, and a similar course might also naturally have been followed by the great states of the Northwest whose interests were so closely bound up with the waterways running southward. It was essential that no effort should be spared to bring the loyal states of the West into control of the line of the Mississippi. More than 12 months was still required after the capture of New Orleans on the 1st of May, 1862. Before the surrender of Vicksburg to Grant and of Port Hudson to Banks removed the final barriers to the federal control of the great river. The occupation of the river by the Federals was of importance in more ways than one. The states to the west of the river, Arkansas, Missouri, and Texas, were for the first 2 years of the war important sources of supplies for the food of the Confederate Army. Corn on the cob or in bags was brought across the river by boats, while the herds of live cattle were made to swim the stream, and were then most frequently marched across country to the commissary depots of the several armies. After the fall of Port Hudson, the connection for such supplies was practically stopped. Although I may recall that even as late as 1864, the command to which I was attached had the opportunity of stopping the swimming across the Mississippi of a herd of cattle that was in transit for the army of General Joe Johnston. In April 1862, just after the receipt by Lincoln of the disappointing news of the first repulse at Vicksburg, he finds time to write a little autograph note to a boy, Master Crocker, with thanks for a present of a white rabbit that the youngster had sent to the president, with the suggestion that perhaps the president had a boy who would be pleased with it. During the early part of 1862, Lincoln is giving renewed thought to the great problem of emancipation. He becomes more and more convinced that the success of the war calls for definite action on the part of the administration in the matter of slavery. He was, as before pointed out, anxious not only as a matter of justice to loyal citizens, but on the ground of the importance of retaining for the national cause the support of the border states. To act in such manner that the loyal citizens of these states should be exposed to a minimum loss and to the smallest possible risk of disaffection. In July 1862, Lincoln formulated a proposition for compensated emancipation. It was his idea that the nation should make payment of an appraised value in freeing the slaves that were in the ownership of citizens who had remained loyal to the government. It was his belief that the funds required would be more than offset by the result in furthering the progress of the war. The daily expenditure of the government was at the time averaging about $1.5 million a day, and in 1864 it reached $2 million a day. If the war could be shortened a few months, a sufficient amount of money would be saved to offset a very substantial payment to loyal citizens for the property rights in their slaves. The men of the border states were, however, Congress was naturally not ready to give support to such a policy unless it could be made clear that it was satisfactory to the people most concerned. The result of the unwise stubbornness in this matter of the loyal citizens of Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Maryland was that they were finally obliged to surrender without compensation the property control in their slaves. When the plan for compensated emancipation had failed, Lincoln decided that the time had come for unconditional emancipation. In July 1862, he prepares the first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. It was his judgment, which was shared by the majority of his cabinet, that the issue of the proclamation should, however, be deferred until after some substantial victory by the armies of the North. It was undesirable to give to such a step the character of an utterance of despair or even of discouragement. It seemed evident, however, that the war had brought the country to the point at which slavery, the essential cause of the cleavage between the states, must be removed. The bringing to an end of the national responsibility for slavery would consolidate national opinion throughout the states of the North and would also strengthen the hands of the friends of the Union in England, where the charge had repeatedly been made that the North was fighting not against slavery or for freedom of any kind, but for domination. The proclamation was held until after the Battle of Antietam in September 1862, and was then issued to take effect on the 1st of January 1863. It did produce the hoped-for results. The cause of the North was now placed on a consistent foundation. It was made clear that when the fight for nationality had reached a successful termination, there was to be no further national responsibility for the great crime against civilization. The management of the contrabands, who were from week to week making their way into the lines of the Northern armies, was simplified. There was no further question of holding colored men subject to the possible claim of a possibly loyal master. The work of organizing colored troops, which had begun in Massachusetts some months earlier in the year, was now pressed forward with some measure of efficiency. Boston sent to the front the 54th and 55th Massachusetts regiments composed of colored troops and led by such men as Shaw and Hallowell. The 1st South Carolina Colored Regiment was raised and placed under the command of Colonel Higginson. I had myself some experience in Louisiana with the work of molding plantation hands into disciplined soldiers, and I was surprised at the promptness of the transformation. A contraband who made his way into the camp from the old plantation with the vague idea that he was going to secure freedom was often in appearance but an unpromising specimen out of which to make a soldier. He did not know how to hold himself upright or to look the other man in the face. His gait was shambly, his perceptions dull. It was difficult for him either to hear clearly or to understand when heard the word of instruction or command. When, however, the plantation rags had been disposed of and possibly after a souse in the Mississippi, the contraband had been put into the blue uniform and had had the gun placed on his shoulder, he developed at once from a chattel to a man. He was still, for a time at least, clumsy and shambly. The understanding of the word of command did not come at once, and his individual action, if by any chance he should be left to act alone, was, as a rule, less intelligent, less to be depended upon, than that of the white man. But he stood up straight in the garb of manhood, looked you fairly in the face, showed by his expression that he was anxious for the privilege of fighting for freedom and for citizenship. And in Louisiana, and throughout the whole territory of the war, every black regiment that came into engagement showed that it could be depended upon. Before the war was closed, some 200,000 Negroes had been brought into the ranks of the Federal Army, and their service constituted a very valuable factor in the final outcome of the campaigns. A battle like that at Milliken's Bend, Mississippi, inconsiderable in regard to the numbers engaged, was of distinctive importance in showing what the black man was able and willing to do when brought under fire for the first time. A colored regiment made up of men who only a few weeks before had been plantation hands, had been left on a point of the river to be picked up by an expected transport. The regiment was attacked by a Confederate force of double or treble the number, the Southerners believing that there would be no difficulty in driving into the river this group of recent slaves. On the first volley, Practically all of the officers who were white were struck down, and the loss with the troops was also very heavy. The Negroes, who had but made a beginning with their education as soldiers, appeared, however, not to have learned anything about the conditions for surrender, and they simply fought on until no one was left standing. The percentage of loss to the numbers engaged was the heaviest of any action in the war. The Southerners, in their contempt for the possibility of Negroes doing any real fighting, had in their rushing attack exposed themselves much and had themselves suffered seriously. When, in April 1865, after the forcing back of Lee's lines, the hour came, so long waited for and so fiercely fought for, to take possession of Richmond, there was a certain poetic justice in allowing the Negro division, commanded by General Weitzel, to head the column of advance. Through 1862, and later, we find much correspondence from Lincoln in regard to the punishment of deserters. The army penalty for desertion when the lines were in front of the enemy was death. Lincoln found it very difficult, however, to approve of a sentence of death for any soldier. Again and again he writes, instructing the general in the field to withhold the execution until he, Lincoln, had had an opportunity of passing upon the case. There is a long series of instances in which, sometimes upon application from the mother, but more frequently through the personal impression gained by himself of the character of the delinquent, Lincoln decided to pardon youngsters who had, in his judgment, simply failed to realize their full responsibility as soldiers. Not a few of these men, permitted to resume their arms, gained distinction later for loyal service. In December 1862, Jefferson Davis issued an order which naturally attracted some attention, directing that General Benjamin F. Butler, when captured, should be reserved for execution. Butler never fell into the hands of the Confederates, and it is probable that, if he had been taken prisoner, the order would have remained an empty threat. From Lincoln came the necessary rejoinder that a Confederate officer of equal rank would be held as hostage for the safety of any Northern general who, as prisoner, might not be protected under the rules of war. Lincoln's correspondence during 1862, a year which was in many ways the most discouraging of the sad years of the war, shows how much he had to endure in the matter of pressure of unrequested advice and of undesired counsel from all kinds of voluntary advisers and active-minded citizens, all of whom believed that their views were important, if not essential, for the salvation of the state. In September 1862, Lincoln writes to a friend, "I am approached with the most opposite opinions expressed on the part of religious men, each of whom is equally certain that he represents the divine will." To one of these delegations of ministers, Lincoln gave a response which, while homely in its language, must have presented to his callers a vivid picture of the burdens that were being carried by the leader of the state. "Gentlemen," he said, "suppose all the property you possess were in gold, and you had placed it in the hands of Blondin to carry across the Niagara River on a rope. With slow, cautious, steady steps he walks the rope, bearing your all. Would you shake the cable and keep shouting to him, 'Blondin, stand up a little straighter, Blondin, stoop a little more. Go a little faster, lean more to the south, now lean a little more to north. Would that be your behavior in such an emergency? No. You would hold your breath, every one of you, as well as your tongues. You would keep your hands off until he was safe on the other side. Another delegation, which had been urging some months in advance of what Lincoln believed to be the fitting time for the issuing of the Proclamation of Emancipation, called asking that there should be no further delay in the action. One of the ministers, as he was retiring, turned and said to Lincoln, "What you have said to us, Mr. President, compels me to say to you in reply that it is a message to you from our divine Master through me, commanding you, sir, to open the doors of bondage, that the slave may go free." Lincoln replied, "That may be, sir, for I have studied this question by night and by day, for weeks and for months. But if it is, as you say, a message from your divine Master, is it not odd that the only channel he could send it by was that roundabout route through the wicked city of Chicago?" Another version of the story omits the reference to Chicago and makes Lincoln's words, "I hope it will not be irreverent for me to say that if it is probable that God would reveal his will to others on a point so connected with my duty, it might be supposed he would reveal it directly to me. Whatever shall appear to be God's will, I will do." In September 1862, General Lee carried his army into Maryland, threatening Baltimore and Washington. It is probable that the purpose of this invasion was more political than military. The Confederate correspondence shows that Davis was at the time hopeful of securing the intervention of Great Britain and France, and it was natural to assume that the prospects of such intervention would be furthered if it could be shown that the Southern Army, instead of being engaged in the defense of its own capital, was actually threatening Washington and was possibly strong enough to advance farther north. General Pope had, as a result of his defeat at the Second Bull Run in July 1862, lost the confidence of the President and of the country. The defeat alone would not necessarily have undermined his reputation, which had been that of an effective soldier. He had, however, the fatal quality, too common with active Americans, of talking too much, whether in speech or in the written word, of promising things that did not come off, and of emphasizing his high opinion of his own capacity. Under the pressure of the new peril indicated by the presence of Lee's troops within a few miles of the capital, Lincoln put to one side his own grave doubts in regard to the effectiveness and trustworthiness of McClellan and gave McClellan one further opportunity to prove his ability as a soldier. The personal reflections and aspersions against his commander-in-chief of which McClellan had been guilty weighed with Lincoln not at all. The President's sole thought was at this time, as always, how with the material available could the country best be served. McClellan had his chance, and to few men is it given to have more than one great opportunity, and again he threw it away. His army was stronger than that of Lee, and he had the advantage of position, and for the first time against this particular antagonist of nearness to his base of supplies, Lee had been compelled to divide his army in order to get it promptly into position on the north side of the Potomac. McClellan's tardiness sacrificed Harper's Ferry, which, on September 15th, was actually surrounded by Lee's advance with the loss of 12,000 prisoners. Through an exceptional piece of good fortune, there came into McClellan's hands a dispatch showing the actual position of the different divisions of Lee's army, and giving evidence that the two wings were so far separated that they could not be brought together within 24 hours. The history now makes clear that for 24 hours McClellan had the safety of Lee's army in his hands. But those precious hours were spent by McClellan in getting ready, that is to say, in vacillating. Finally, there came the trifling success at South Mountain and the drawn battle of Antietam. Lee's army was permitted to recross the Potomac with all its trains and even with the captured prisoners, and McClellan lay waiting through the weeks for something to turn up. A letter written by Lincoln on the 13th of October shows a wonderfully accurate understanding of military conditions, and throws light also upon the character and the methods of thought of the two men. Are you not overcautious when you assume that you cannot do what the enemy is constantly doing? Should you not claim to be at least his equal in prowess, and act upon the claim? As I understand, you telegraphed General Halleck that you cannot subsist your army at Winchester unless the railroad from Harper's Ferry to that point be put in working order. But the enemy does now subsist his army at Winchester, at a distance nearly twice as great as you would have to do. He is certainly not more than half as well provided with wagons as you are. Again, one of the standard maxims of war, as you know, is to operate upon the enemy's communications without exposing your own. You seem to act as if this applies against you, but cannot apply it in your favor. Change positions with the enemy, and think you not he would break your communication with Richmond in 24 hours? You are now nearer Richmond than the enemy is by the route you can and he must take. Why can you not reach there before him, unless you admit that he is more than your equal on a march? His route is the arc of a circle, while yours is the chord. The roads are as good on your side as on his. If he should move northward, I would follow him closely, holding his communications. If he should prevent our seizing his communications and move towards Richmond, I would press closely to him. Fight him, if a favorable opportunity should present, and at least try to beat him to Richmond on the inside track. I say try. If we never try, we shall never succeed. We never can when we bear the wastage of going to him. As we must beat him somewhere or fail finally, we can do it, if at all, easier near to us than far away. It is all easy if our troops march as well as the enemy, and it is unmanly to say that they cannot do it. The patience of Lincoln and that of the country behind Lincoln were at last exhausted. McClellan was ordered to report to his home in New Jersey, and the general who had come to the front with such flourish of trumpets, and had undertaken to dictate a national policy at a time when he was not able to keep his own army in position, retires from the history of the war. the responsibility again comes to the weary commander-in-chief of finding a leader who could lead, in whom the troops and the country would have confidence, and who could be trusted to do his simple duty as a general in the field, without confusing his military responsibilities with political scheming. The choice first fell upon Burnside. Burnside was neither ambitious nor self-confident. He was a good division general, but he doubted his ability for the general command. Burnside loyally accepts the task, does the best that was within his power, and, pitted against a commander who was very much his superior in general capacity as well as in military skill, he fails. Once more has the President on his hands the serious problem of finding the right man. This time, the commission was given to General Joseph Hooker. With the later records before us, it is easy to point out that this selection also was a blunder. There were better men in the group of major generals. Reynolds, Meade, or Hancock would doubtless have made more effective use of the power of the Army of the Potomac. But in January 1863, the relative characters and abilities of these generals were not so easily to be determined. Lincoln's letter to Hooker was noteworthy, not only in the indication that it gives of Hooker's character, but as an example of the President's width of view and of his method of coming into the right relation with men. He writes, "You have confidence in yourself, which is a valuable if not an indispensable quality. I think, however, that during General Burnside's command of the army, you have taken counsel of your ambition, and have thwarted him as much as you could, in which you did a great wrong to the country, and to a most meritorious and honorable brother officer. I have heard of your recently saying that both the army and the government needed a dictator. Of course, it was not for this, but in spite of it, that I have given you the command. Only those generals who gain success can set up as dictators. What I now ask of you is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship. The government will support you to the best of its ability, which is neither more nor less than it has done and will do for all its commanders. Beware of rashness, but with energy and sleepless vigilance go forward and give us victories." Hooker, like Burnside, undoubtedly did the best that he could. He was a loyal patriot and had shown himself a good division commander. It is probable, however, that the limit of his ability as a general in the field was the management of an army corps. He seems to have been confused in the attempt to direct the movements of the larger body. At Chancellorsville, he was clearly outwitted by his opponents, Lee and Jackson. The men of the Army of the Potomac fought steadily as always, but with the discouraging feeling that the soldiers on the other side of the line had the advantage of better brain power behind them. It is humiliating to read in the life of Jackson the reply given by him to Lee when Lee questioned the safety of the famous march planned by Jackson across the front of the Federal line. Said Lee, "There are several points along the line of your proposed march at which your column could be taken in flank with disastrous results." "But, General Lee," replies Jackson, "we must surely in planning any military movements take into account the personality of the leaders to whom we are opposed." Romans 7, the third and crucial year of the war. Chancellorsville was fought and lost, and again, under political pressure from Richmond rather than with any hope of advantage on simple military lines. Lee leads his army to an invasion of the North. For this there were at the time several apparent advantages. The Army of the Potomac had been twice beaten and, while by no means demoralized, was discouraged and no longer had faith in its commander. There was much inevitable disappointment throughout the North that, so far from making progress in the attempt to restore the authority of the government, the national troops were on the defensive but a few miles from the national capital. The Confederate correspondence from London and from Paris gave fresh hopes for the long-expected intervention. Lee's army was cleverly withdrawn from Hooker's front and was carried through western Maryland into Pennsylvania by the old line of the Shenandoah Valley and across the Potomac at Falling Waters. Hooker reports to Lincoln under date of June 4th that the army, or an army, is still in his front on the line of the Rappahannock. Lincoln writes to Hooker under date of June 5th, "We have report that Lee's army is moving westward, and that a large portion of it is already to the west of the Blue Ridge. The bull is across the fence, and it surely ought to be possible to worry him." On June 14th, Lincoln writes again, reporting to Hooker that Lee, with the body of his troops, is approaching the Potomac at a point 40 miles away from the line of the entrenchments on the Rappahannock. The animal is extended over a line of 40 miles. It must be very slim somewhere. Can you not cut it? The phrases are not in military form, but they give evidence of sound military judgment. Hooker was unable to grasp the opportunity, and realizing this himself, he asked to be relieved. The troublesome and anxious honor of the command of the army now falls upon General Meade. He takes over the responsibility at a time when Lee's army is already safely across the Potomac and advancing northward, apparently towards Philadelphia. His troops are more or less scattered, and no definite plan of campaign appears to have been formulated. The events of the next 3 weeks constitute possibly the best-known portion of the war. Meade shows good energy in breaking up his encampment along the Rappahannock and getting his column onto the road northward. Fortunately, the Army of the Potomac for once has the advantage of the interior line, so that Meade is able to place his army in a position that protects at once Washington on the southwest, Baltimore on the east, and Philadelphia on the northeast. We can, however, picture to ourselves the anxiety that must have rested upon the commander-in-chief in Washington during the weeks of the campaign, and during the 3 days of the great battle, which was fought on northern soil and miles to the north of the northern capital. If, on that critical 3rd day of July, the Federal lines had been broken and the army disorganized, there was nothing that could prevent the national capital from coming into the control of Lee's army. The surrender of Washington meant the intervention of France and England, meant the failure of the attempt to preserve the nation's existence, meant that Abraham Lincoln would go down to history as the last president of the United States, the president under whose leadership the national history had come to a close. But the Federal lines were not broken. The 3rd day of Gettysburg made clear that with equality of position, and with substantial equality in numbers, there was no better fighting material in the Army of the Gray than in the Army of the Blue. The advance of Pickett's division to the crest of Cemetery Ridge marked the high tide of the Confederate cause. Longstreet's men were not able to prevail against the sturdy defense of Hancock's Second Corps, and when, on the 4th of July, Lee's army took up its line of retreat to the Potomac, leaving behind it thousands of dead and wounded, the calm judgment of Lee and his associates must have made clear to them that the cause of the Confederacy was lost. The Army of Northern Virginia had shattered itself against the defenses of the North, and there was for Lee no reserve line. For a long series of months to come, Lee, magnificent engineer officer that he was, and with a sturdy persistency which withstood all disaster, was able to maintain defensive lines in the Wilderness, at Cold Harbor, and in front of Petersburg. He must have realized long before the day of Appomattox that his task was impossible. What Gettysburg decided in the East was confirmed with equal emphasis by the fall of Vicksburg in the West. On the 4th of July, 1863, the day on which Lee, defeated and discouraged, was taking his shattered army out of Pennsylvania, General Grant was placing the stars and stripes over the earthworks of Vicksburg. The Mississippi was now under the control of the Federalists from its source to the mouth, and that portion of the Confederacy lying to the west of the river was cut off so that from this territory no further co-operation of importance could be rendered to the armies either of Johnston or of Lee. Lincoln writes to Grant after the fall of Vicksburg, giving, with his word of congratulation, the admission that he, Lincoln, had doubted the wisdom or the practicability of Grant's movement to the south of Vicksburg and inland to Jackson. "You were right," said Lincoln, "and I was wrong." On the 19th of November, 1863, comes the Gettysburg Address, so eloquent in its simplicity. It is probable that no speaker in recorded history ever succeeded in putting into so few words so much feeling, such suggestive thought, and such high idealism. The speech is one that children can understand, and that the greatest minds must admire. There was disappointment that Meade had not shown more energy after Gettysburg in the pursuit of Lee's army, and that some attempt, at least, had not been made to interfere with the retreat across the Potomac. Military critics have in fact pointed out that Meade had laid himself open to criticism in the management of the battle itself. At the time of the repulse of Pickett's charge, Meade had available at the left and in rear of his center the Sixth Corps, which had hardly been engaged on the previous 2 days, and which included some of the best fighting material in the army. It has been pointed out more than once that if that corps had been thrown in at once with a countercharge upon the heels of the retreating divisions of Longstreet, Lee's right must have been curled up and overwhelmed. If this had happened, Lee's army would have been so seriously shattered that its power for future service would have been inconsiderable. Meade was accepted as a good working general, but the occasion demanded something more forcible in the way of leadership, and early in 1864, Lincoln sends for the man who by his success in the West had won the hopeful confidence of the President and the people. Before this, appointment of general-in-chief was given to General Grant, and he came to the East to take charge of the armies in Virginia. He had brought to a successful conclusion a dramatic campaign, of which Chattanooga was the center. In September 1863, General Rosecrans, who had occupied Chattanooga, was defeated some 20 miles to the south on the field of Chickamauga. a defeat which was the result of too much confidence on the part of the Federal commander, who in pressing his advance had unwisely separated the great divisions of his army, and of excellent skill and enterprise on the part of the Confederate commander, General Bragg. If the troops of Rosecrans had not been veterans, and if the right wing had not been under the immediate command of so sturdy and unconquered a veteran as General Thomas, the defeat might have become a rout. As it was, the army retreated with some discouragement but in good fighting force to the lines of Chattanooga, by skillful disposition of his forces across the lines of connection between Chattanooga and the base of supplies. General Bragg brought the Federals almost to the point of starvation, and there was grave risk that through the necessary falling back of the army to secure supplies, the whole advantage of the previous year's campaign might be lost. Grant was placed in charge of the forces in Chattanooga, and by a good management of the resources available, he succeeded in reopening the river and what became known as the Cracker Line, and in November 1863, in the dramatic battles of Lookout Mountain, fought more immediately by General Hooker, and of Missionary Ridge, the troops of which were under the direct command of General Sherman, overwhelmed the lines of Bragg and pressed his forces back into a more or less disorderly retreat. An important factor in the defeat of Bragg was the detaching from his army of the corps under Longstreet, which had been sent to Knoxville in a futile attempt to crush Burnside and to reconquer East Tennessee for the Confederacy. This plan, chiefly political in purpose, was said to have originated with President Davis. The armies of the West were now placed under the command of General Sherman, and early in 1864, Grant was brought to Virginia to take up the perplexing problem of overcoming the sturdy veterans of General Lee. The first action of Grant as commander of all the armies in the field was to concentrate all the available forces against the two chief armies of the Confederacy. The old policy of occupying outlying territory for the sake of making a show of political authority was given up. If Johnston in the West and Lee in the East could be crushed, the national authority would be restored in due season, and that was the only way in which it could be restored. Troops were gathered in from Missouri and Arkansas and Louisiana, and were placed under the command of Sherman for use in the final effort of breaking through the center of the Confederacy. While in the East nothing was neglected on the part of the new administration to secure for the direction of the new commander all resources available of men and of supplies, Grant now finds himself pitted against the first soldier of the continent, the leader who is to go down to history as probably the greatest soldier that America has ever produced. Lee's military career is a wonderful example of a combination of brilliancy, daring ingenuity of plan, promptness of action, and patient persistence under all kinds of discouragement. But it was not only through these qualities that it was possible for him to retain control. Through 3 years of heavy fighting of the territory of Virginia, which came to be the chief bulwark of the Confederacy, Lee's high character, sweetness of nature, and unselfish integrity of purpose had impressed themselves not only upon the Confederate administration, which had given him the command, but upon every soldier in that command. For the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee was the man behind the guns, just as Lincoln came to be for all the men in blue. There never was a more devoted army, and there probably never was a better handled army than that with which Lee defended for 3 years the lines across northern Virginia, and the remnants of which were finally surrendered at Appomattox. Grant might well have felt concerned with such an opponent in front of him. He had on his hands, as had been the almost uniform condition for the Army of the Potomac, the disadvantage of position. His advance must be made from exterior lines, and nearly every attack was to be against well-entrenched positions that had been first selected years back and had been strengthened from season to season. On the other hand, Grant was able to depend upon the loyal support of the administration, through which came to his army the full advantage of the great resources of the North. His ranks as depleted were filled up. His commissary trains need never be long unsupplied. His ammunition wagons were always equipped. For Lee, during the years following the Gettysburg battle, the problem was unending and increasing. How should the troops be fed, and whence should they secure the fresh supplies of ammunition? Between Grant and Lincoln there came to be perfect sympathy of thought and action. The men had in their nature, though not in their mental equipment, much in common. Grant carries his army through the spring of 1864, across the much fought-over territory, marching and fighting from day to day towards the southwest. The effort is always to outflank Lee's right, getting in between him and his base at Richmond, but after each fight, Lee's army always bars the way. Marching out of the wilderness after 7 days' fierce struggle, Grant still finds the line of gray blocking his path to Richmond. The Army of the Potomac had been marching and fighting without break for weeks. There had been but little sleep, and the food in the trains was often far out of the reach of the men in the fighting line. Men and officers were alike exhausted, while advantages had been gained at one point or another along the line. And while it was certain that the opposing army had also suffered severely, there had been no conclusive successes to inspirit the troops with the feeling that they were to seize victory out of the campaign. In emerging from the wilderness, the head of the column reached the crossroads, the left fork of which led back to the Potomac, and the right fork to Richmond or to Petersburg. In the previous campaigns, the Army of the Potomac, after doing its share of plucky fighting and taking more than its share of discouragement, had at such a point been withdrawn for rest and recuperation. It was not an unnatural expectation that this course would be taken in the present campaign. The road to the right meant further fatigue and further continuous fighting for men who were already exhausted. In the leading brigade, it was only the brigade commander and the adjutant who had knowledge of the instructions for the line of march. When, with a wave of the hand of the adjutant, the guidon flag of the brigade was carried to the right and the head of the column was set towards Richmond, a shout went up from the men marching behind the guidon. It was an utterance not of discouragement but of enthusiasm. Exhausting as the campaign had been, the men in the ranks preferred to fight it out then, and to get through with it. Old soldiers as they were able to understand the actual issue of the contest. Their plucky opponents were as exhausted as themselves, and possibly even more exhausted. It was only through the hammering of Lee's diminishing army out of existence that the war could be brought to a close. The enthusiastic shout of satisfaction rolled through the long column reaching 20 miles back, as the news passed from brigade to brigade that the army was not to be withdrawn but was, as Grant's report to Lincoln was worded, to fight it out on this line, if it took all summer. When this report reached Lincoln, he felt that the selection of Grant as lieutenant general had been justified. He said, "We need this man, he fights." In July 1864, Washington is once more within reach, if not of the invader, at least of the raider. The Federal forces had been concentrated in Grant's lines along the James, and General Jubal Early, one of the most energetic fighters of the Southern Army, tempted by the apparently unprotected condition of the capital, dashed across the Potomac on a raid that became famous. It is probable that in this undertaking, as in some of the other movements that have been referred to on the part of the Southern leaders, the purpose was as much political as military. Early's force of from 15 to 16,000 men was, of course, in no way strong enough to be an army of invasion. The best success for which he could hope would be, in breaking through the defenses of Washington, to hold the capital for a day or even a few hours. The capture of Washington in 1864, as in 1863 or in 1862, would in all probability have brought about the long-hoped-for intervention of France and England. General Lew Wallace, whose name became known in the years after the war through some noteworthy romances, Ben-Hur and the Fair God, and who was in command of a division of troops stationed west of Washington, and composed in part of loyal Marylanders and in part of convalescents who were about to be returned to the front, fell back before Early's advance to Monocacy Creek. He disposed his thin line cleverly in the thickets on the east side of the creek in such fashion as to give the impression of a force of some size with an advance line of skirmishers. Early's advance was checked for some hours before he realized that there was nothing of importance in front of him, when Wallace's division was promptly overwhelmed and scattered. The few hours that had thus been saved were, however, of first importance for the safety of Washington. Early reached the outer lines of the fortifications of the capital sometime after sunset. His immediate problem was to discover whether the troops which were, as he knew, being hurried up from the Army of the James, had reached Washington, or whether the capital was still under the protection only of its so-called home guard of veteran reserves. These reserves were made up of men more or less crippled and unfit for work in the field, but who were still able to do service on fortifications. They comprised in all about 6,000 men, and were under the command of Colonel Weiswell. The force was strengthened somewhat that night by the addition of all of the male nurses from the hospitals themselves, convalescents who were able to bear arms. That night the women nurses, who had already been in attendance during the hours of the day, had to render double service. Lincoln had himself in the afternoon stood on the works watching the dust of the Confederate advance. Once more there came to the President, who had in his hands the responsibility for the direction of the war, the bitterness of the feeling, if not of possible failure, at least of immediate mortification. He knew that within 24 or 36 hours Washington could depend upon receiving the troops that were being hurried up from Grant's army. But he also realized what enormous mischief might be brought about by even a momentary occupation of the national capital by Confederate troops. I had some personal interest in this side campaign. The 19th Army Corps, to which my own regiment belonged, had been brought from Louisiana to Virginia, and had been landed on the James River to strengthen the ranks of General Butler. There had not been time to assign to us posts in the trenches, and we had, in fact, not even been placed in position. We were more nearly in marching order than any other troops available, and it was therefore the divisions of the 19th Army Corps that were selected to be hurried up to Washington. To these were added 2 divisions of the 6th Corps, Colonel Weiswell, commanding the defenses of the city, realized the nature of his problem. He had got to hold the lines of Washington, cost what it might, until the arrival of the troops from Grant. He took the bold step of placing on the picket line that night every man within reach, or at least every loyal man within reach, for plenty of the men in Washington were looking and hoping for the success of the South. The instructions usually given to pickets were in this instance reversed. The men were ordered, in place of keeping their positions hidden, and of maintaining absolute quiet, to move from post to post along the whole line. And they were also ordered, without any reference to the saving of ammunition, to shoot off their carbines on the least possible pretext and without pretext. The armories were then beginning to send to the front sharps repeating carbines. The invention of breech-loading rifles came too late to be of service to the infantry on either side, but during the last year of the war, certain brigades of cavalry were armed with Sharp's breech-loaders. The infantry weapon used through the war by the armies of the North as by those of the South was the muzzle-loading rifle, which bore the name on our side of the Springfield, and on the Confederate side of the Enfield. The larger portion of the Northern rifles were manufactured in Springfield, Massachusetts, while the Southern rifles, in great part imported from England, took their name from the English factory. It was of convenience for both sides that the 2 rifles were practically identical, so that captured pieces and captured ammunition could be interchanged without difficulty. Early's skirmish line was instructed early in the night to feel the Federal pickets, an instruction which resulted in a perfect blaze of carbine fire from Weiswell's men. The report that went to Early was that the picket line must be about 6,000 strong. The conclusion on the part of the old Confederate commander was that the troops from the Army of the Potomac must have reached the city. If that were true, there was, of course, no chance that on the following day he could break through the entrenchments, while there was considerable risk that his retreat to the Shenandoah might be cut off. Early the next morning, therefore, the disappointed Early led his men back to Falling Waters. I happened during the following winter, when in prison in Danville, to meet a Confederate lieutenant who had been on Early's staff and who had lost an arm in this little campaign. He reported that when Early, on recrossing the Potomac, learned that he had had Washington in his grasp and that the divisions marching to its relief did not arrive and could not have arrived for another 24 hours, he was about the maddest Early that the lieutenant had ever seen. And, added the lieutenant, when Early was angry, the atmosphere became blue. Roman 8. The final campaign. After this close escape, it was clear to Grant, as it had been clear to Lincoln, that whatever forces were concentrated before Petersburg, the line of advance for Confederate invaders through the Shenandoah must be blocked. General Sheridan was placed in charge of the Army of the Shenandoah and the 19th Corps, instead of returning to the trenches of the James, marched on from Washington to Martinsburg and Winchester. In September, the commander in Washington had the satisfaction of hearing that his old assailant Early had been sent whirling through Winchester by the fierce advance of Sheridan. Lincoln recognized the possibility that Early might refuse to stay defeated and might make use, as had so often before been done by Confederate commanders in the Valley, of the short interior line to secure reinforcements from Richmond and to make a fresh attack. On the 29th of September, 20 days before this attack came off, Lincoln writes to Grant, "Lee may be planning to reinforce Early. Care should be taken to trace any movement of troops westward." On the 19th of October, the persistent old fighter Early, not willing to acknowledge himself beaten and understanding that he had to do with an army that for the moment did not have the advantage of Sheridan's leadership, made his plucky, and for the time successful, fight at Cedar Creek. The arrival of Sheridan at the critical hour in the afternoon of the 19th of October did not, as has sometimes been stated, check the retreat of a demoralized army. Sheridan found his army driven back, to be sure, from its first position, but in occupation of a well-supported line across the pike from which had just been thrown back the last attack made by Early's advance. It was Sheridan, however, who decided not only that the battle which had been lost could be regained, but that the work could be done to best advantage right away on that day. And it was Sheridan who led his troops through the 2 short hours of the October afternoon back to their original position, from which before dark they were able to push Early's fatigued fighters across Cedar Creek southward. Lincoln had found another man who could fight. He was beginning to be able to put trust in leaders who, instead of having to be replaced, were with each campaign gathering fresh experience and more effective capacity. From the West also came reports, in this autumn of 1864, from a fighting general. Sherman had carried the army, after its success at Chattanooga, through the long line of advance to Atlanta, by outflanking movements against Joe Johnston, the Fabius of the Confederacy, and when Johnston had been replaced by the headstrong Hood, had promptly taken advantage of Hood's rashness to shatter the organization of the Army of Georgia. The capture of Atlanta in September 1864 brought to Lincoln in Washington and to the North the feeling of certainty that the days of the Confederacy were numbered. The second invasion of Tennessee by the army of Hood, rendered possible by the march of Sherman to the sea, appeared for the moment to threaten the control that had been secured of the all-important region of which Nashville was the center. But Hood's march could only be described as daring but futile. He had no base and no supplies. His advance did some desperate fighting at the Battle of Franklin and succeeded in driving back the rearguard of Thomas' army, ably commanded by General Schofield, but the Confederate ranks were so seriously shattered that when they took position in front of Nashville, they no longer had adequate strength to make the siege of the city serious even as a threat. Thomas had only to wait until his own preparations were completed, and then, on the same day in December on which Sherman was entering Savannah, Thomas, so to speak, took possession of Hood's army. After the fight at Nashville, there were left of the Confederate invaders only a few scattered divisions. It was just before the news of the victory at Nashville that Lincoln made time to write the letter to Mrs. Bixby, whose name comes into history as an illustration of the thoughtful sympathy of the great captain. I have been shown in the files of the War Department a statement of the Adjutant General of Massachusetts that you are the mother of 5 sons who died gloriously on the field of battle. I feel how weak and fruitless must be any words of mine which should attempt to beguile you from the grief of a loss so overwhelming. But I cannot refrain from tendering to you the consolation that may be found in the thanks of the Republic they died to save. I pray that our Heavenly Father may assuage the anguish of your bereavement and leave you only the cherished memory of the loved and lost, and the pride that must be yours to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom. In March 1864, Lincoln writes to Grant, New York votes to give votes to the soldiers. Tell the soldiers. The decision of New York in regard to the collection from the soldiers in each field of the votes for the coming presidential election was in line with that arrived at by all of the states. The plan presented difficulties and, in connection with the work of special commissioners, it involved also expense. It was, however, on every ground desirable that the men who were risking their lives in defense of the nation should be given the opportunity of taking part in the selection of the nation's leader, who was also under the Constitution the commander-in-chief of the armies in the field. The votes of some 400,000 men constituted also an important factor in the election itself. I am not sure that the attempt was ever made to separate and classify the soldiers' vote, but it is probable that although the Democratic candidate was McClellan, a soldier who had won the affection of the men serving under him, and the opposing candidate was a civilian, a substantial majority of the vote of the soldiers was given to Lincoln. Secretary Chase had fallen into the habit of emphasizing what he believed to be his indispensability in the cabinet by threatening to resign, or even by submitting a resignation, whenever his suggestions or conclusions met with opposition. These threats had been received with patience up to the point when patience seemed to be no longer a virtue. But finally, when in May 1864 such a resignation was tendered under some aggravation of opposition or of criticism, very much to Chase's surprise the resignation was accepted. The secretary had had in train for some months active plans for becoming the Republican candidate for the presidential campaign of 1864. Evidence had from time to time during the preceding year been brought to Lincoln of Chase's antagonism and of his hopes of securing the leadership of the party. Chase's opposition to certain of Lincoln's policies was doubtless honest enough. He had brought himself to believe that Lincoln did not possess the force and the qualities required to bring the war to a close. He had also convinced himself that he, Chase, was the man, and possibly was the only man, who was fitted to meet the special requirements of the task. Mr. Chase did possess the confidence of the more extreme of the anti-slavery groups throughout the country. His administration of the Treasury had been able and valuable. But the increasing difficulty that had been found in keeping the Secretary of the Treasury in harmonious relations with the other members of the administration caused his retirement to be on the whole a relief. Lincoln came to the conclusion that more effective service could be secured from some other man, even if possessing less ability, whose temperament made it possible for him to work in cooperation. The unexpected acceptance of the resignation caused to Chase and to Chase's friends no little bitterness, which found vent in sharp criticisms of the president. Neither bitterness nor criticisms could, however, prevent Lincoln from retaining a cordial appreciation for the abilities and the patriotism of the man. And, later in the year, Lincoln sent in his nomination as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Chase himself, in his lack of capacity to appreciate the self-forgetfulness of Lincoln's nature, was probably more surprised by his nomination as Chief Justice than he had been by the acceptance of his resignation as Secretary of the Treasury. In July 1864 comes a fresh risk of international complications through the invasion of Mexico by a French army commanded by Bazaine, 7 years later to be known as the more or less Hero of Metz. Lotus Napoleon had been unwilling to give up his dream of a French empire, or of an empire instituted under French influence in the Western Hemisphere. He was still hopeful, if not confident, that the United States would not be able to maintain its existence, and he felt assured that if the Southern Confederacy should finally be established with the friendly co-operation of France, he would be left unmolested to carry out his own schemes in Mexico. He had induced an honest-minded, but not very clear-headed Prince Maximilian, the brother of the Emperor of Austria, to accept a throne in Mexico to be established by French bayonets, and which, as the result showed, could sustain itself only while those bayonets were available. The presence of French troops on American soil brought fresh anxieties to the administration, but it was recognized that nothing could be done for the moment, and Lincoln and his advisers were hopeful that the Mexicans, before their capital had been taken possession of by the invader, would be able to maintain some national government until, with the successful close of its own war, the United States could come to the defense of the sister republic. The extreme anti-slavery group of the Republican Party had, as indicated, never been fully satisfied with the thoroughness of the anti-slavery policy of the administration, and Mr. Chase retained until the action of the convention in June the hope that he might through the influence of this group secure the presidency. Lincoln remarks in connection with this candidacy, "If Chase becomes president, all right. I hope we may never have a worse man." From the more conservative wing of the Republican Party came suggestions as to the nomination of Grant, and this plan brought from Lincoln the remark, "If Grant takes Richmond, by all means let him have the nomination." When the delegates came together, however, in Baltimore, it was evident that, representing as they did the sober and well thought-out convictions of the people, no candidacy but that of Lincoln could secure consideration, and his nomination was practically unanimous. The election in November gave evidence that, even in the midst of civil war, a people's government can sustain the responsibility of a national election. The large popular majorities in nearly all of the voting states constituted not only a cordial recognition of the service that was being rendered by Lincoln and by Lincoln's administration, but a substantial assurance that the cause of nationality was to be sustained with all the resources of the nation. The presidential election of this year gave the final blow to the hopes of the Confederacy. I had myself a part in a very small division of this election, a division which could have no effect in the final gathering of the votes, but which was in a way typical of the spirit of the army. On the 6th of November, 1864, I was in Libby Prison, having been captured at the Battle of Cedar Creek in October. It was decided to hold a presidential election in the prison, although some of us were rather doubtful as to the policy and anxious in regard to the result. The exchange of prisoners had been blocked for nearly a year on the ground of the refusal, on the part of the South, to exchange the colored troops or white officers who held commissions in colored regiments. Lincoln took the ground, very properly, that all of the nation's soldiers must be treated alike and must be protected by a uniform policy. Until the colored troops should be included in the exchange, there can, said Lincoln, be no exchanging of prisoners. This decision, while sound, just, and necessary, brought naturally a good deal of dissatisfaction to the men in prison and to their friends at home. When I reached Libby in October, I found there men who had been prisoners for 6 or 7 months, and who, as far as they lived to get out, were to be prisoners for 5 months more. Through the winter of 1864-65, the illness and mortality in the Virginia prisons of Libby and Danville were very severe. It was, in fact, a stupid barbarity on the part of the Confederate authorities to keep any prisoners in Richmond during that last winter of the war. It was not easy to secure by the 2 lines of road, one of which was continually being cut by our troops, sufficient supplies for Lee's army. It was difficult to bring from the granaries farther south, in addition to the supplies required for the army, food for the inhabitants of the town. It was inevitable under the circumstances that the prisoners should be neglected, and that, in addition to the deaths from cold, the blankets, the overcoats, and the shoes had been taken from the prisoners because they were needed by the rebel troops, there should be further deaths from starvation. It was not unnatural that under such conditions the prisoners should have ground not only for bitter indignation with the prison authorities, but for discontent with their own administration. One may in fact be surprised that starving and dying men should have retained any assured spirit of loyalty. When the vote for president came to be counted, we found that we had elected Lincoln by more than 3-1. The soldiers felt that Lincoln was the man behind the guns. The prison votes, naturally enough, reached no ballot boxes, and my individual ballot in any case would not have been legal, as I was at the time but 20 years of age. I can but feel, however, that this vote of the prisoners was typical and important, and I have no doubt it was so recognized when later the report of the voting reached Washington. In December 1864 occurred one of the too frequent cabals on the part of certain members of the cabinet. Pressure was brought to bear upon Lincoln to get rid of Seward. Lincoln's reply made clear that he proposed to remain president. He says to the member reporting for himself and his associates the protest against Seward, "I propose to be the sole judge as to the dismissal or appointment of the members of my cabinet." Lincoln could more than once have secured peace within the cabinet and a smoother working of the administrative machinery if he had been willing to replace the typical and idiosyncratic men whom he had associated with himself in the government by more commonplace citizens, who would have been competent to carry on the routine responsibilities of their posts. The difficulty of securing any consensus of opinion or any working action between men differing from each other as widely as did Chase, Stanton, Blair, and Seward in temperament, in judgment, and in honest convictions as to the proper policy for the nation, was an attempt that brought upon the chief daily burdens and many keen anxieties. Lincoln insisted, however, that it was all important for the proper carrying on of the contest that the cabinet should contain representatives of the several loyal sections of the country and of the various phases of opinion. The extreme anti-slavery men were entitled to be heard even though their spokesman Chase was often intemperate, ill-judged, bitter, and unfair. The border states men had a right to be represented, and it was all essential that they should feel that they had a part in the war government even though their spokesman Blair might show himself, as he often did show himself, quite incapable of understanding, much less of sympathizing with, the real spirit of the North. Stanton might be truculent and even brutal, but he was willing to work. He knew how to organize. He was devotedly loyal. Seward, scholar and statesman as he was, had been ready to give needless provocation to Europe, and was often equally ill-judged in his treatment of the conservative border states on the one hand, and of the New England abolitionists on the other. But Seward was a patriot as well as a scholar, and was a representative not only of New York, but of the best of the Whig Republican sentiment of the entire North. And Seward could not be spared. Tact and genius of one man was made to do effective work. In February 1865, in response to suggestions from the South which indicated the possibility of peace, Lincoln accepted a meeting with Alexander H. Stephens and 2 other commissioners to talk over measures for bringing the war to a close. The meeting was held on a gunboat on the James River. It seems probable from the later history that Stephens had convinced himself that the Confederacy could not conquer its independence, and that it only remained to secure the best terms possible for a surrender. On the other hand, Jefferson Davis was not yet prepared to consider any terms short of a recognition of the independence of the Confederacy, and Stephens could act only under the instructions received from Richmond. It was Lincoln's contention that the government of the United States could not treat with rebels, or, dropping the word rebels, with its own citizens in arms. The first step in negotiations must, said Lincoln, be the laying down of arms. There is no precedent in history for a government entering into negotiations with its own armed citizens. But there is a precedent, Mr. Lincoln, said Stephens. King Charles of England treated with the Cromwellians. Yes, said Lincoln, I believe that is so. I usually leave historical details to Mr. Seward, who is a student. It is, however, my memory that King Charles lost his head. It soon became evident that there was no real basis for negotiations, and Stephens and his associates had to return to Richmond disappointed. In the same month was adopted by both houses of Congress the 13th Amendment, which prohibited slavery throughout the whole dominion of the United States. By the close of 1865, it is probable that among these 33, there were several states the names of which were hardly familiar to some of the older citizens of the South. The men who had accepted the responsibility for the rebellion. The state of mind of these older Southerners, in regard more particularly to the resources of the Northwest, was recalled to me years after the war by an incident related by General Sherman at a dinner of the New England Society. Sherman said that during the march through Georgia he had found himself one day at noon, when near the head of his column, passing below the piazza of a comfortable-looking old plantation house. He stopped to rest on the piazza with one or two of his staff and was received by the old planter with all the courtliness that a Southern gentleman could show. Even to an invader, when doing the honors of his own house, the general and the planter sat on the piazza, looking at the troops below and discussing, as it was inevitable under the circumstances that they must discuss, the causes of the war. General, said the planter, what troops are those passing below? The general leans over the piazza and calls to the standard bearers, throw out your flag, boys, and as the flag was thrown out, he reports to his host, the 30th Wisconsin. Wisconsin, said the planter. Wisconsin. Where is Wisconsin? It is one of the states of the Northwest, said Sherman. When I was studying geography, said the planter, I knew of Wisconsin simply as the name of a tribe of Indians. How many men are there in a regiment? Well, there were 1,000 when they started, said Sherman. Do you mean to say, said the planter, that there is a state called Wisconsin that has sent 30,000 men into your armies? Oh, probably 40,000, answered Sherman. With the next battalion the questions and the answers are repeated. The flag was that of a Minnesota regiment, say the 32d. The old planter had never heard that there was such a state. My God, he said when he had figured out the thousands of men who had come to the front from these so-called Indian territories to maintain the existence of the nation, if we in the South had known that you had turned those Indian territories into great states, we never should have gone into this war. The incident throws a light upon the state of mind of men in the South, even of well-educated men in the South, at the outbreak of the war. They might, of course, have known by statistics that great states had grown up in the Northwest, representing a population of millions, and able themselves to put into the field armies to be counted by the thousand. They might have realized that these great states of the Northwest were vitally concerned with the necessity of keeping the Mississippi open for their trade from its source to the Gulf of Mexico. They might have known that those states, largely settled from New England, this knowledge was within their reach, but they had not realized the facts of the case. It was their feeling that in the coming contest they would have to do only with New England and the Middle States, and they felt that they were strong enough to hold their own against this group of opponents. That feeling would have been justified. The South could never have been overcome, and the existence of the nation could never have been maintained if it had not been for the loyal co-operation and the magnificent resources of men and of national wealth that were contributed to the cause by the states of the Northwest. In 1880, I had occasion, in talking to the 2,000 students of the University of Minnesota, to recall the utterance of the old planter. The students of that magnificent university, placed in a beautiful city of 250,000 inhabitants, found it difficult on their part to realize, amidst their laughter at the ignorance of the old planter, just what the relations of the South had been before the war to the new free communities of the Northwest. In February 1865, with the fall of Fort Fisher and the capture of Wilmington, the control of the coast of the Confederacy became complete. The Southerners and their friends in Great Britain and the Bahamas, a group of friends whose sympathies for the cause were very much enhanced by the opportunity of making large profits out of their friendly relations, had shown during the years of the war exceptional ingenuity, daring, and persistence in carrying on the blockade running. The ports of the British West Indies were very handy, and particularly during the stormy months of the winter, it was hardly practicable to maintain an absolutely assured barrier of blockades along a line of coast aggregating about 2,000 miles. The profits on a single voyage, on the cotton taken out, and on the stores brought back were sufficient to make good the loss of both vessel and cargo in 3 disastrous trips. The blockade runners, Southerners and Englishmen, took their lives in their hands, and they fairly earned all the returns that came to them. I happened to have early experience of the result of the fall of Fort Fisher and of the final closing of the last inlet for British goods. I was at the time in prison in Danville, Virginia. I was one of the few men in the prison. The group comprised about a dozen who had been fortunate enough to retain a toothbrush. We wore our toothbrushes fastened into the front buttonholes of our blouses, partly possibly from ostentation, but chiefly for the purpose of keeping them from being stolen. I was struck by receiving an offer one morning from the lieutenant of the prison guard of $300 for my toothbrush. The dollars meant, of course, Confederate dollars, and I doubtless hardly realized from the scanty information that leaked into the prison how low down in February 1865 Confederate currency had depreciated, but still it was a large sum, and the toothbrush had been in use for a number of months. It then leaked out from a word dropped by the lieutenant that no more English toothbrushes could get into the Confederacy, and those of us who had been studying possibilities on the coast realized that Fort Fisher must have fallen. In this same month of February, into which were crowded some of the most noteworthy of the closing events of the war, Charleston was evacuated as Sherman's army on its sweep northward passed back of the city. I am not sure whether the fiercer of the old Charlestonians were not more annoyed at the lack of attention paid by Sherman to the fire-eating little city in which 4 years back had been fired the gun that opened the war, than they would have been by an immediate and strenuous occupation. Sherman had more important matters on hand than the business of looking after the original fire-eaters. He was hurrying northward, close on the heels of Johnston, to prevent, if possible, the combination of Johnston's troops with Lee's army, which was supposed to be retreating from Virginia. On the 4th of March comes the second inaugural, in which Lincoln speaks almost in the language of a Hebrew prophet. The feeling is strong upon him that the clouds of war are about to roll away, but he cannot free himself from the oppression that the burdens of the war have produced. The emphasis is placed on the all-important task of bringing the enmities to a close with the end of the actual fighting. He points out that responsibilities rest upon the North as well as upon the South, and he invokes from those who, under his leadership, are bringing the contest to a triumphant close, their sympathy and their help for their fellow men who have been overcome. The address is possibly the most impressive utterance ever made by a national leader, and it is most characteristic of the fineness and largeness of nature of the man. I cite the closing paragraph. If we shall suppose that slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God needs must come, and which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe to those by whom the offense came. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in the living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it should continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsmen in 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid for by another drop of blood drawn by the war, as was said 2,000 years ago, so still it must be said, that the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether, with malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and for his orphans, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. After the election of 1864, Lincoln's word had been a common cause, a common interest, and a common country. The invocation in this last inaugural is based upon the understanding that there is again a common country, and that in caring for those who have been in the battle and in the binding up of the wounds, there is to be no distinction between the men of the gray and those of the blue. At the close of February, Lee, who realizes that his weakened lines cannot much longer be maintained, proposes to Grant terms of adjustment. Grant replies that his duties are purely military and that he has no authority to discuss any political relations. On the 1st of April, the right wing of Lee's army is overwhelmed and driven back by Sheridan at Five Forks, and on the day following Richmond is evacuated by the rear guard of Lee's army. The defense of Richmond during the long years of the war, a defense which was carried on chiefly from the entrenchments of Petersburg, by the skill of the engineers and by the patient courage of the troops, had been magnificent. It must always take a high rank in the history of war operations. The skillful use made of positions of natural strength, the high skill shown in the construction of works to meet first one emergency and then another, the economic distribution of constantly diminishing resources, the clever disposition of forces, which during the last year were being steadily reduced from month to month, in such fashion that at the point of probable contact there seemed to be always men enough to make good the defense. These things were evidence of the military skill, the ingenuity, the resourcefulness, and the enduring courage of the leaders. The skill and character of Lee and his associates would, however, of course have been in vain, and the lines would have been broken not in 1865, but in 1863 or in 1862, if it had not been for the magnificent patience and heroism of the rank and file that fought in the gray uniform under the stars and bars, and whose fighting during the last of those months was done in tattered uniforms, and with a ration less by from 1/4 to 1/2 than that which had been accepted as normal. On the 2nd of April, the Stars and Stripes are borne into Richmond by the advance brigade of the right wing of Grant's army under the command of General Weitzel. There was a certain poetic justice in the decision that the responsibility for making first occupation of the city should be entrusted to the colored troops. The city had been left by the rear guard of the Confederate army in a state of serious confusion. The Confederate general in charge, Lee, had gone out in the advance hoping to be able to break his way through to North Carolina, had felt justified, for the purpose of destroying such army stores, chiefly ammunition, as remained, in setting fire to the storehouses, and in so doing he had left whole quarters of the city exposed to flame. White stragglers and Negroes who had been slaves had, as would always be the case where all authority is removed, yielded to the temptation to plunder, and the city was full of drunken and irresponsible men. The colored troops restored order and appear to have behaved with perfect discipline and consideration. The marauders were arrested, imprisoned, and, when necessary, shot. The fires were put out as promptly as practicable, but not until a large amount of very unnecessary damage and loss had been brought upon the stricken city. The women who had locked themselves into their houses were agreeably surprised to find that their immediate safety and the peace of the town depended upon the invaders, and that the first battalions of these were the despised and much hated blacks. Upon the 4th of April, against the council, and in spite of the apprehensions of nearly all his advisers, Lincoln insisted upon coming down the river from Washington and making his way into the rebel capital. There was no thought of vaingloriousness or of posing as the victor. He came under the impression that some civil authorities would probably have remained in Richmond, with whom immediate measures might be taken to stop unnecessary fighting, and to secure for the city and for the state a return of peaceful government. Thomas Nast, who while not a great artist was inspired to produce during the war some of the most graphic and storytelling records in the shape of pictures of events, made a drawing which was purchased later by the New York Union League Club, showing Lincoln on his way through Main Street, with the colored folks of the town and of the surrounding country crowding about the man whom they hailed as their deliverer, and in their enthusiastic adoration trying to touch so much as the hem of his garment. The picture is history in showing what actually happened, and it is pathetic history in recalling how great were the hopes that came to the colored people from the success of the North and from the certainty of the end of slavery. It is sad to recall the many disappointments that during the 40 years since the occupation of Richmond have hampered the uplifting of the race. Lincoln's hope that some representative of the Confederacy might have remained in Richmond, if only for the purpose of helping to bring to a close as rapidly as possible the waste and burdens of continued war, was not realized. The members of the Confederate government seem to have been interested only in getting away from Richmond, and to have given no thought to the duty they owed to their own people to cooperate with the victors in securing a prompt return of law and order. On the 9th of April came the surrender of Lee at Appomattox, 4 years, less 3 days, from the date of the firing of the first gun of the war at Charleston. The muskets turned in by the ragged and starving files of the remnants of Lee's army represented only a small portion of those which a few days earlier had been holding the entrenchments at Petersburg. As soon as it became evident that the army was not going to be able to break through the Federal lines and begin a fresh campaign in North Carolina, the men scattered from the retreating columns right and left, in many cases carrying their muskets to their own homes as a memorial fairly earned by plucky and persistent service. There never was an army that did better fighting, or that was better deserving of the recognition, not only of the states in behalf of whose so-called independence the war had been waged, but on the part of opponents who were able to realize the character and the effectiveness of the fighting. The scene in the little farmhouse, where the two commanders met to arrange the terms of surrender, was dramatic in more ways than one. General Lee had promptly given up his own baggage wagon for use in carrying food for the advance brigade, and as he could save but one suit of clothes, he had naturally taken his best. He was, therefore, notwithstanding the fatigues and the privations of the past week, in full dress uniform. He was one of the handsomest men of his generation, and his beauty was not only of feature but of expression of character. Grant, who never gave much thought to his personal appearance, had for days been away from his baggage train, and under the urgency of keeping as near as possible to the front line with reference to the probability of being called to arrange terms for surrender, he had not found the opportunity of securing a proper coat in place of his fatigue blouse. I believe that even his sword had been mislaid, but he was able to borrow one for the occasion from a staff officer. When the main details of the surrender had been talked over, Grant looked about the group in the room, which included, in addition to 2 staff officers who had come with Lee, a group of 5 or 6 of his own assistants, who had managed to keep up with the advance, to select the aide who should write out the paper. His eye fell upon Colonel Ely Parker, a brigade commander who had during the past few months served on Grant's staff. "Colonel Parker, I will ask you," said Grant, as the only real American in the room, "to draft this paper." Parker was a full-blooded Indian, belonging to one of the Iroquois tribes of New York. Grant's suggestion that the United States had no requirement for the horses of Lee's army, and that the men might find these convenient for spring plowing, was received by Lee with full appreciation. The first matter in order after the completion of the surrender was the issue of rations to the starving Southern troops. "General Grant," said Lee, "a train was ordered by way of Danville to bring rations to meet my army, and it ought to be now at such a point," naming a village 8 or 9 miles to the southwest. General Sheridan, with a twinkle in his eye, now put in a word, "The train from the south is there, General Lee. Or at least it was there yesterday. My men captured it, and the rations will be available." General Lee turns, mounts his old horse Traveler, a valued comrade, and rides slowly through the ranks, first of the blue and then of the gray. Every hat came off from the men in blue, as an expression of respect to a great soldier and a true gentleman. While from the ranks in gray, there was one great sob of passionate grief, and finally, almost for the first time in Lee's army, a breaking of discipline as the men crowded forward to get a closer look at, or possibly a grasp of the hand of, the great leader who had fought and failed, but whose fighting and whose failure had been so magnificent. Roman 9. Lincoln's task ended. On the 11th of April, Lincoln makes his last public utterance. In a brief address to some gathering in Washington, he says, "There will shortly be announcement of a new policy." It is hardly to be doubted that the announcement which he had in mind was to be concerned with the problem of Reconstruction. He had already outlined in his mind the essential principles on which the readjustment must be made. In this same address, he points out that whether or not the seceded states be out of the Union, they are out of their proper relations to the Union. We may feel sure that he would not have permitted the essential matters of readjustment to be delayed while political lawyers were arguing over the constitutional issue. On one side was the group which maintained that in instituting the rebellion, and in doing what was in their power to destroy the national existence, the people of the seceding states had forfeited all claims to the political liberty of their communities. According to this contention, the slave states were to be treated as conquered territory, and it simply remained for the government of the United States to reshape this territory as might be found convenient or expedient. According to the other view, as secession was itself something which was not to be admitted, being, from the constitutional point of view, impossible, there never had in the legal sense of the term been any secession. The instant the armed rebellion had been brought to an end, the rebelling states were to be considered as having resumed their old-time relations with the states of the North and with the central government. They were under the same obligations as before for taxation, for subordination in foreign relations, and for the acceptance of the control of the federal government on all matters classed as federal. On the other hand, they were entitled to the privileges that had from the beginning been exercised by independent states, namely, the control of their local affairs on matters not classed as federal, and they had a right to their proportionate representation in Congress and to their proportion of the electoral vote for president. It has been very generally recognized in the South as in the North that if Lincoln could have lived, the Southerners would have realized that the head of the government had a cordial and sympathetic interest in doing what might be practicable not only to re-establish their relations as citizens of the United States, but to further in every way the return of their communities to prosperity, a prosperity which, after the loss of the property in their slaves and the enormous destruction of their general resources, seemed to be sadly distant. On the 14th of April comes the dramatic tragedy ending on the day following in the death of Lincoln. The word dramatic applies in this instance with peculiar fitness. While the nation mourned for the loss of its leader, while the soldiers were stricken with grief that their great captain should have been struck down, while the South might well be troubled that the control and adjustment of the great interstate perplexities was not to be in the hands of the wise, sympathetic, and patient ruler, for the worker himself the rest, after the 4 years of continuous toil and fearful burdens and anxieties, might well have been grateful. The great task had been accomplished, and the responsibilities accepted in the first inaugural had been fulfilled. In March 1861, Lincoln had accepted the task of steering the nation through the storm of rebellion, the divided opinions and counsels of friends, and the fierce onslaught of foes at home and abroad. In April 1865, the national existence was assured, the nation's credit was established, the troops were prepared to return to their homes and resume their work as citizens. At no time in history had any people been able against such apparently overwhelming perils and difficulties to maintain a national existence. There was, therefore, notwithstanding the great misfortune, for the people South and North, in the loss of the wise ruler at a time when so many difficulties remained to be adjusted, a dramatic fitness in having the life of the leader close just as the last army of antagonists was laying down its arms. The first problem of the war that came to the administration of 1861 was that of restoring the flag over Fort Sumter. On the 14th of April, the day when Booth's pistol was laying low the President, General Anderson, who 4 years earlier had so sturdily defended Sumter, was fulfilling the duty of restoring the Stars and Stripes. The news of the death of Lincoln came to the army of Sherman, with which my own regiment happened at the time to be associated. On the 17th of April, on leaving Savannah, Sherman had sent word to the North to have all the troops who were holding posts along the coasts of North Carolina concentrated on a line north of Goldsboro. It was his dread that General Johnston might be able to effect a junction with the retreating forces of Lee, and it was important to do whatever was practicable, either with forces or with a show of forces, to delay Johnston and to make such combination impossible. A thin line of Federal troops was brought into position to the north of Johnston's advance, but Sherman himself kept so closely on the heels of his plucky and persistent antagonist that, irrespective of any opposing line to the north, Johnston would have found it impossible to continue his progress towards Virginia. He was checked at Goldsboro after the Battle of Bentonville, and it was at Goldsboro that the last important force of the Confederacy was surrendered. We soldiers learned only later some of the complications that preceded that surrender. President Davis and his associates in the Confederate government had, with one exception, made their way south, passing to the west of Sherman's advance. The exception was Postmaster General Reagan, who had decided to remain with General Johnston. He appears to have made good with Johnston the claim that he, Reagan, represented all that was left of the Confederate government. He persuaded Johnston to permit him to undertake the negotiations with Sherman, and he had, it seems, the ambition of completing with his own authority the arrangements that were to terminate the war. Sherman, simple-hearted man that he was, permitted himself, for the time, to be confused by Reagan's semblance of authority. He executed with Reagan a convention which covered not merely the surrender of Johnston's army, but the preliminaries of a final peace. This convention was of course made subject to the approval of the authorities in Washington. When it came into the hands of President Johnson, it was, under the counsel of Seward and Stanton, promptly disavowed. Johnson instructed Grant, who had reported to Washington from Appomattox, to make his way at once to Goldsboro, and, relieving Sherman, to arrange for the surrender of Johnston's army on the terms of Appomattox. Grant's response was characteristic. He said in substance, "I am here, Mr. President, to obey orders, and under the decision of the Commander-in-Chief, I will go to Goldsboro and will carry out your instructions. I prefer, however, to act as a messenger simply. I am entirely unwilling to take out of General Sherman's hands the command of the army that is so properly Sherman's army, and that he has led with such distinctive success. General Sherman has rendered too great a service to the country to make it proper to have him now humiliated on the ground of a political blunder. And I at least am unwilling to be in any way a party to his humiliation." Stanton was disposed to approve of Johnson's first instruction and to have Sherman at once relieved, but the man who had just come from Appomattox was too strong with the people to make it easy to disregard his judgment on a matter which was in part at least military. The President was still new to his office, and he was still prepared to accept counsel. The matter was, therefore, arranged as Grant desired. Grant took the instructions and had his personal word with Sherman, but this word was so quietly given that none of the men in Sherman's army, possibly no one but Sherman himself, knew of Grant's visit. Grant took pains so to arrange the last stage of his journey that he came into the camp at Goldsboro well after dark, and, after an hour's interview with Sherman, he made his way at once northward outside of our lines and of our knowledge. On Grant's arrival, Sherman at once assumed that he was to be superseded. "No, no," said Grant, "do you not see that I have come without even a sword? There is here no question of superseding the commander of this army, but simply of correcting an error and of putting things as they were. This convention must be cancelled. You will have no further negotiation with Mr. Reagan or with any civilian claiming to represent the Confederacy. Your transactions will be made with the commander of the Confederate Army, and you will accept the surrender of that army on the terms that were formulated at Appomattox." Sherman was keen enough to understand what must have passed in Washington, and was able to appreciate the loyal consideration shown by General Grant in the successful effort to protect the honor and the prestige of his old comrade. The surrender was carried out on the 26th of April, 11 days after the death of Lincoln. Johnston's troops, like those of Lee, were distributed to their homes. The officers retained their side arms, and the men, leaving their rifles, took with them not only such horses and mules as they still had with them connected with the cavalry or artillery, but also a number of horses and mules which had been captured by Sherman's army and which had not yet been placed on the United States Army roster. Sherman understood, as did Grant, the importance of giving to these poor farmers whatever facilities might be available to enable them again to begin their homework. Word was at once sent to General Johnston after Grant's departure that the only terms that could be considered was a surrender of the army, and that the details of such surrender Sherman would himself arrange with Johnston. Reagan slipped away southward and is not further heard of in history. The record of Lincoln's relations to the events of the war would not be complete without a reference to the capture of Jefferson Davis. On returning to Washington after his visit to Richmond, Lincoln had been asked what should be done with Davis when he was captured. The answer was characteristic. "I do not see," said Lincoln, "that we have any use for a white elephant." Lincoln's clear judgment had at once recognized the difficulties that would arise in case Davis should become a prisoner. The question as to the treatment of the ruler of the late Confederacy was very different from, and much more complicated than, the fixing of terms of surrender for the Confederate armies. If Davis had succeeded in getting out of the country, it is probable that the South, or at least a large portion of the South, would have used him as a kind of a scapegoat. Many of the Confederate soldiers were indignant with Davis for his bitter animosities to some of their best leaders. Davis was a capable man and had in him the elements of statesmanship. He was, however, vain and, like some other vain men, placed the most importance upon the capacities in which he was the least effective. He had had a brief and creditable military experience, serving as a lieutenant with Scott's army in Mexico, and he had impressed himself with the belief that he was a great commander. Partly on this ground, and partly apparently as a result of general incompatibility of temper, Davis managed to quarrel at different times during the war with some of the generals who had shown themselves the most capable and the most serviceable. He would probably have quarreled with Lee if it had been possible for any one to make quarrel relations with that fine-natured gentleman, and if Lee had not been too strongly entrenched in the hearts of his countrymen to make any interference with him unwise. Even for the President, Davis had, however, managed to interfere very seriously with the operations of men like Beauregard, Sidney Johnson, Joseph Johnston, and other commanders whose continued leadership was most important for the Confederacy. It was the obstinacy of Davis that had protracted the war through the winter and spring of 1865, long after it was evident from the reports of Lee and of the other commanders that the resources of the Confederacy were exhausted, and that any further struggle simply meant an inexcusable loss of life on both sides. As a Northern soldier who has had experience in Southern prisons, I may be excused also from bearing in mind the fearful responsibility that rests upon Davis for the mismanagement of those prisons, a mismanagement which caused the death of thousands of brave men on the frozen slopes of Belle Isle, on the foul floors of Libby and Danville, and on the rotten ground used for 3 years as a living place and as a dying place within the stockade at Andersonville. Davis received from month to month the reports of the conditions in these and in the other prisons of the Confederacy. Davis could not have been unaware of the stupidity and the brutality of keeping prisoners in Richmond during the last winter of the war, when the lines of road still open were absolutely inadequate to supply the troops in the trenches or the people of the town. Reports were brought to Davis more than once from Andersonville showing that a large portion of the deaths that were there occurring were due to the vile and rotten condition of the hollow in which for years prisoners had been huddled together. But the appeal made to Richmond for permission to move the stockade to a clean and dry slope was put to one side as a matter of no importance. The entire authority in the matter was in the hands of Davis, and a word from him would have remedied some of the worst conditions. He must share with General Winder, the immediate superintendent of the prisons, the responsibility for the heedless and brutal mismanagement, a mismanagement which brought death to thousands and which left thousands of others cripples for life. As a result of the informal word given by Lincoln, it was generally understood, by all the officers at least, in charge of posts and picket lines along the eastern slope, that Davis was not to be captured. Unfortunately, it had not proved possible to get this informal expression of a very important piece of policy conveyed throughout the lines farther west. An enterprising and overzealous captain of cavalry, riding across from the Mississippi to the coast, heard of Davis' party in Florida, and, butting in, captured, on May 10th, the White Elephant. The last commands of the Confederate Army were surrendered with General Taylor in Louisiana on the 4th of May and with Kirby Smith in Texas on the 26th of May, as Lincoln had foreshadowed. Not a few complications resulted from this unfortunate capture of Davis, complications that were needlessly added to by the lack of clear-headedness or of definite policy on the part of a confused and vacillating president. During the months in which Davis was a prisoner at Fortress Monroe, and while the question of his trial for treason was being fiercely debated in Washington, the sentiment of the Confederacy naturally concentrated upon its late president. He was, as the single prisoner, the surviving emblem of the contest. His vanities, irritability, and blunders were forgotten. It was natural that, under the circumstances, his people, the people of the South, should hold in memory only the fact that he had been their leader, and that he had through 4 strenuous years borne the burdens of leadership with unflagging zeal, with persistent courage, and with an almost foolhardy hopefulness. He had given to the Confederacy the best of his life, and he was entitled to the adoration that the survivors of the Confederacy gave to him as representing the ideal of the lost cause. The feeling with which Lincoln was regarded by the men in the front, for whom through the early years of their campaigning he had been not only the leader but the inspiration, was indicated by the manner in which the news of his death was received. I happened myself on the day of those sad tidings to be with my division in a little village just outside of Goldsboro, North Carolina. We had no telegraphic communication with the North, but were accustomed to receive dispatches about noon each day, carried across the swamps from a station through which connection was made with Wilmington and the North. In the course of the morning, I had gone to the shanty of an old darky whom I had come to know during the days of our sojourn, for the purpose of getting a shave. The old fellow took up his razor, put it down again, and then again lifted it up. But his arm was shaking, and I saw that he was so agitated that he was not fitted for the task. "Massa," he said, "I can't shave yer this mornin'." "What is the matter?" I inquired. "Well," he replied, "somethin's happened to Massa Linkum." "Why," said I, "nothing has happened to Lincoln. I know what there is to be known." "What are you talking about?" "Well," the old man replied with a half-sob, "we colored folks, we get news, or we get half news, sooner than you uns. I done know jest what it is, but somethin' has gone wrong with Massa Linkum." I could get nothing more out of the old man, but I was sufficiently anxious to make my way to division headquarters to see if there was any news in advance of the arrival of the regular courier. The colored folks were standing in little groups along the village street, murmuring to each other or waiting with anxious faces for the bad news that they were sure was coming. I found the brigade adjutant and those with him were puzzled like myself at the troubled minds of the darkies, but still skeptical as to the possibility of any information having reached them, which was not known through the regular channels. At noon, the courier made his appearance riding by the wood lane across the fields, and the instant he was seen we all realized that there was bad news. The man was hurrying his pony and yet seemed to be very unwilling to reach the lines where his report must be made. In this instance, as was, of course, not usually the case, the courier knew what was in his dispatches. The division adjutant stepped out on the porch of the headquarters with the paper in his hand. The division commander took the word and was able simply to announce, "Lincoln is dead." The word "president" was not necessary, and he sought in fact for the shortest word. I never before had found myself in a mass of men overcome by emotion. 10,000 soldiers were sobbing together. No survivor of the group can recall the sadness of that morning without again being touched by the wave of emotion which broke down the reserve and control of these war-worn veterans on learning that their great captain was dead. The whole people had come to have with the president a relation similar to that which had grown up between the soldiers and their commander-in-chief. With the sympathy and love of the people to sustain him, Lincoln had over them an almost unlimited influence. His capacity for toil, his sublime patience, his wonderful endurance, his great mind and heart, his outreaching sympathies, his thoughtfulness for the needs and requirements of all, had bound him to his fellow citizens by an attachment of genuine sentiment. His appellation throughout the country had during the last year of the war become Father Abraham. We may recall in the thought of this relation to the people the record of Washington. The first president has come into history as the father of his country, but for Washington this role of father is something of historic development. During Washington's lifetime, or certainly at least during the years of his responsibilities as general and as president, there was no such general recognition of the leader and ruler as the father of his country. He was dear to a small circle of intimates. He was held in respectful regard by a larger number of those with whom were carried on his responsibilities in the army, and later in the nation's government. To many good Americans, however, Washington represented for years an antagonistic principle of government. He was regarded as an aristocrat, and there were not a few political leaders with groups of voters behind them who dreaded, and doubtless honestly dreaded, that the influence of Washington might be utilized to build up in this country some fresh form of the monarchy that had been overthrown. The years of the presidency had to be completed, and the bitter antagonisms of the 7 years' fighting and of the issues of the Constitution building had to be outgrown, before the people were able to recognize as a whole the perfect integrity of purpose and consistency of action of their great leader. The first president, even then when the animosities and suspicions had died away, while the people were ready to honor the high character and the accomplishments of Washington, the feeling was one of reverence rather than of affection. This sentiment gave rise later to the title of the Father of his country, but there was no such personal feeling towards Washington as warranted, at least during his life, the term Father of the People. 30 years later, the ruler of the nation is Andrew Jackson, a man who was, like Lincoln, eminently a representative of the common people. His fellow citizens knew that Jackson understood their feelings and their methods, and were ready to have full confidence in Jackson's patriotism and honesty of purpose. His nature lacked, however, the sweet sympathetic qualities that characterized Lincoln, and while to a large body of his fellow citizens he commended himself for sturdiness, courage, and devotion to the interests of the state, he was never able for himself to overcome the feeling that a man who failed to agree with the Jackson policy must be either a knave or a fool. He could not place himself in the position from which the other fellow was thinking or acting. He believed that it was his duty to maintain what he held to be the popular cause against the schemes of the aristocrats. The bugbear of that day, he was a fighter from his youth up, and his theory of government was that of enforcing the control of the side for which he was the partisan. Such a man could never be accepted as the father of the people. Lincoln, coming from those whom he called the common people, was able in the development of his powers to be accepted as the peer of the largest intellects in the land, while knowing what was needed by the poor whites of Kentucky. He could understand also the point of view of Boston, New York, or Philadelphia. In place of emphasizing antagonisms, he held consistently that the highest interest of one section of the country must be the real interest of the whole people, and that the ruler of the nation had upon him the responsibility of so shaping the national policy that all the people should recognize the government as their government. It was this large understanding and width of sympathy that made Lincoln, in a sense which could be applied to no other ruler of this country, the people's president, and no other ruler in the world has ever been so sympathetically, so effectively in touch with all of the fellow citizens for whose welfare he made himself responsible. The Latin writer Aulus Gellius uses for one of his heroes the term a classic character. These words seem to me fairly to apply to Abraham Lincoln. An appreciative Englishman, writing in the London Nation at the time of the centennial commemoration, says of Lincoln, "The greatness of Lincoln was that of a common man raised to a high dimension. The possibility, still more the existence, of such a man is itself a justification of democracy. We do not say that so independent, so natural, so complete a man cannot in older societies come to wield so large a power over the affairs and the minds of men. We can only say that amid all the stirring movements of the 19th century he has not so done. The existence of what may be called a widespread commonalty explains the rarity of personal eminence in America. There has been and still remains a higher general level of personality than in any European country, and the degree of eminence is correspondingly reduced. It is just because America has stood for opportunity that conspicuous individuals have been comparatively rare. Strong personality, however, has not been rare. It is the abundance of such personality that has built up silently into the rising fabric of the American Commonwealth. Pioneers, roadmakers, traders, lawyers, soldiers, teachers, toiling terribly over the material and moral foundation of the country, few of whose names have emerged or survived. Lincoln was of this stock.